Imagine stepping inside a building where sunlight pours through stained glass in every color. The columns rise around you like the trunks of ancient trees. The ceiling is so high above you that it almost disappears into the light. This is the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, Spain. It is one of the most visited buildings on Earth, and it is not even finished yet. Construction has been going on for 144 years. Yes, 144 years. And only now, in 2026, has the tallest tower finally reached its full height. At 172.5 meters, the Sagrada Familia is now the tallest church on Earth. But here is the part that stays with you long after you leave. The man who designed most of this building knew he would never see it finished. Antoni Gaudi spent 43 years of his life on this single project. He died in 1926, and his building kept growing without him for another century. What kind of person gives everything to something they cannot complete? That question is at the heart of this story. And the answer begins not with Gaudi, but with a bookseller most people have never heard of. His name was Josep Maria Boccabella, and his journey started with a pilgrimage to Rome. In 1866, Boccabella traveled from Barcelona to Rome on a religious pilgrimage. He was not an architect, not a priest, and not a wealthy man. He was a bookseller, someone who made a modest living selling books. But that single pilgrimage to Rome changed the course of his entire life. He returned to Barcelona with a vision that would outlast him by generations. He wanted to build a temple dedicated to the Holy Family. Not just any temple, an expiatory one. What does that word actually mean in this context? An expiatory temple is built as an act of spiritual atonement for the sins of an era. Barcelona was industrializing fast, and Boccabella believed the city was losing its soul. This building would be the spiritual response, a prayer made of stone. He founded a religious association called the Devotees of St. Joseph to fund the project. For over a decade they raised money and searched for a suitable plot of land. Most people assumed the Sagrada Familia was a government project or a church commission. It was neither of those things. From the very first day, every stone was paid for by donations from ordinary people. No government funds, no church treasury, only the faith of individuals. That funding model has held for over 140 years and has never changed. The groundbreaking took place on March 19, 1882, the feast day of St. Joseph. And there was another layer to the story that most visitors do not know. This temple was born during the Renaixenca, a cultural and political renaissance in Catalonia. So from the very start, the Sagrada Familia was not just a church. It was also a powerful symbol of Catalan identity and cultural pride. A bookseller, a pilgrimage, and a dream that outlived everyone who started it. But the first architect Boccabella chose for the job would not last very long. The first architect was a man named Francisco de Paula del Villar. He designed a traditional neo-Gothic cathedral, inspired by Notre Dame de Paris. His design included pointed arches, flying buttresses, and a tall central nave, the standard formula of the era. If that plan had been followed through, the Sagrada Familia would look like dozens of other churches. Beautiful certainly, but not unique among the cathedrals of Europe. But after just 1 year on the project, del Villar resigned. After just 1 year. The reason was a series of creative and administrative conflicts with Boccabella himself. That single disagreement accidentally changed the entire course of architectural history. You would expect a sacred project of this scale to go to an established master architect. Someone with decades of experience and a long record of completed cathedrals. Instead, the job went to a 31-year-old named Antoni Gaudi. He was only 31. At that age, he was largely unknown in the architecture world of Barcelona. He had completed only a handful of small residential and commercial projects. Nobody at the time expected him to turn this commission into his entire life. But that is exactly what happened over the next 43 years. Gaudi took over in 1883, and from that moment forward, everything about the project changed. The very first thing he did was throw out del Villar's blueprints entirely. He threw out every pointed arch, every flying buttress, and every Gothic reference. He had a completely different vision for what this building could become. A vision that nobody in the world had ever attempted before. And it started with a single idea about the difference between straight lines and curves. Gaudi once said something that defined his entire approach to architecture. The straight line belongs to man, the curve belongs to God. And he meant that statement literally. Inside the Sagrada Familia, there is not a single straight line anywhere. Not in the walls, not in the columns, not in the arches. Every surface follows a curve inspired directly by forms found in nature. He used mathematical surfaces called hyperboloids, paraboloids, and helicoids. Those names sound complicated, but the idea behind them is surprisingly simple. Look at a tree trunk, a seashell, or the inside of a human rib cage. Nature does not build with straight lines, it builds with curves that carry weight efficiently. Gaudi saw this principle everywhere he looked in the natural world. Why did he choose curves over the straight lines that every architect before him had used? Because curved surfaces distribute weight through pure compression. That means the building supports itself from within, without any external help. Gothic cathedrals needed massive external supports called flying buttresses to stay upright. Without those buttresses, the walls would collapse outward under their own weight. Gaudi eliminated the need for buttresses entirely. He solved a structural problem that Gothic architects had struggled with for centuries. And he did it by studying trees, bones, and the geometry of shells. Nature itself became his blueprint. While other architects relied on centuries of tradition, Gaudi relied on direct observation. That was his method. Watch how a tree trunk distributes weight outward through its branches. Study how the curve of a rib cage protects organs while carrying load. Every form inside the Sagrada Familia echoes something found in the natural world. Most architects dismissed his methods as irrational. But Gaudi was not interested in following the traditions of his time. He was building an entirely new language of architecture from nothing that existed before. And to prove that his ideas actually worked, he designed an experiment that baffled everyone. Imagine hanging a chain between 2 points and letting it droop under its own weight. The shape that chain naturally forms is called a catenary curve. Now take that drooping shape and flip it completely upside down. The result is a perfect arch that supports itself through compression alone. No external bracing is needed at all. Gaudi turned this simple physical principle into a full engineering method. He built enormous upside-down models using chains, strings, and small bags of lead. Each bag of lead represented the weight that a particular section of the building would carry. The chains pulled into shapes that gravity itself dictated. Then he placed mirrors underneath the hanging models to see the forms right side up. He sat for hours studying the reflections, sometimes by candlelight, late into the night. His assistants reportedly believed his methods were completely irrational during the first months. A grown man staring at chains and mirrors in the dark, it did not inspire confidence. But the results of those experiments were extraordinary. The shapes that gravity created were structurally perfect in every measurement. There was no guesswork and no trial and error, just physics doing the design work. Some of these hanging models filled entire rooms from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of small weights dangled from a web of interconnected strings. The method was most fully developed at a smaller project called the Colonia Ghoul Chapel. At the Sagrada Familia, Gaudi adapted the same principle into more complex ruled surfaces. The geometry inside the building is a direct evolution of what those chains taught him. He allowed gravity to do the engineering. And what gravity revealed became the structural skeleton of the most remarkable interior ever built. An interior that feels less like a building and more like walking through a living forest. Walking inside the Sagrada Familia feels like stepping into a forest. That is not a metaphor, it is an actual forest made entirely of stone. Where did this extraordinary idea come from? A single eucalyptus tree growing right next to Gaudi's workshop. He spent years observing how the trunk split into branches and how branches split into leaves. Then he translated that natural pattern into the column system of the entire building. Each column starts as a polygonal shape at the base. As it rises, it twists with a double rotation and gradually becomes circular. At around 15 to 20 meters, each column branches outward like the limbs of a tree. Every single branch is calculated to carry exactly the weight above it. The trunk is the column, the knot is the capital, and the leaves form the ceiling vaults. Gaudi planned every detail to mirror the anatomy of a real tree. The ceiling reaches 45 meters, the height of a 15-story building. Every meter held up by stone trees. And then there is the light that fills this forest. When afternoon sunlight passes through the west-facing stained glass, warm orange and red fill the space. From the east side, cool blues and greens pour in during the morning hours. The colors shift across the stone floor as the sun moves through the sky. No photograph has ever been able to capture that movement. You would expect a massive stone building to feel cold and heavy inside. Inside the Sagrada Familia, it feels like standing inside a kaleidoscope. There is also something you cannot experience in photographs: the sound. The interior was deliberately designed for massive reverberation. When a choir sings or an organ plays, the sound floats upward through the stone forest. It is as if the building itself were singing back to you from every direction. Gaudi designed all of this, knowing he would never hear it in its completed form. But he left behind enough guidance for future builders to carry the vision forward. And on the outside of the building, one facade tells a story that only Gaudi could shape. Of all the grand facades Gaudi planned, only one was completed in his lifetime. The Nativity facade on the east side of the building tells the story of the birth of Jesus. And it bursts with life in every carved detail. Trees, animals, angels, shepherds, every surface is covered in naturalistic sculptures. How did Gaudi manage to create such remarkably realistic animal figures? He made plaster casts directly from live animals. Turkeys, chickens, geese, frogs, he cast every creature he could find. Other sculptors at the time considered this technique a sign of insufficient artistic skill. But Gaudi discovered that ancient Greek sculptors had used the same method centuries earlier. That discovery gave him the confidence to master the technique completely. And then came the story of the donkey. For the flight into Egypt scene, Gaudi needed a life-sized donkey model. He bought a real donkey from a nearby clay merchant. But the donkey fought violently against every attempt to apply the plaster. So what did they do to solve this problem? They suspended the donkey in the air with ropes tied under its belly. The animal froze in terror, and only then could they apply the plaster successfully. It sounds absurd, but that is exactly how far Gaudi went for anatomical accuracy. Look closely at the base of the facade columns, and you will notice two carved creatures. A tortoise sits on one side, and a sea turtle on the other. Land and sea, both carrying the weight of the stone columns above them. They symbolize that time itself is as unchanging and steady as stone. But on the sides of the facade, chameleon sculptures represent the opposite. Chameleons are creatures of constant change and adaptation. Permanence and change placed side by side on the same wall, that contrast was deliberate. At the very top of the facade, a cypress tree sculpture rises toward the sky. It is crowned with an egg, a symbol of resurrection and the promise of new life. The Nativity facade and the crypt below are the only parts recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They are the pieces that Gaudi personally touched and shaped with his own hands. Everything that came after was built by other architects working from fragments of his vision. And the story of how Gaudi spent his final years reveals just how completely this building consumed him. By 1914, Gaudi had stopped accepting any other commissions or projects. He moved into the workshop inside the Sagrada Familia and rarely left the grounds. His daily lunch was reportedly a single lettuce leaf soaked in milk. The daily meal of Spain's greatest architect. He stopped shaving, wore ragged clothes, and gave every last coin he had to the project. In his final years, he even walked the streets of Barcelona begging for construction donations. People on the street routinely mistook him for a homeless man. The architect had become indistinguishable from the beggars outside his own building. On June 7, 1926, the 73-year-old Gaudi was walking to his daily confession. A tram struck him on the street in the middle of the city. Witnesses looked at his shabby clothes and assumed he was just another beggar. Drivers of passing vehicles refused to carry the injured man. A doctor on the street also declined to offer help. He had no identification on him, nothing to suggest who he really was. Police eventually carried him to a charity hospital, where he received minimal care. The next day, a priest from the Sagrada Familia walked in and recognized the patient. The injured man on the charity bed was Antoni Gaudi. But it was already too late. He died on June 10, 1926, 3 days after the accident. 43 years, and he died unrecognized. Alone, on a hospital bed meant for the poorest patients in the city. His remains were buried in the crypt directly beneath the Sagrada Familia. The building he devoted his entire life to became his final resting place. He had spent every last thing he owned on this one church. He owned no property, no savings, and no possessions of any real value. The only wealth he ever accumulated was built into the walls of the Sagrada Familia. His poverty was not a failure, it was a deliberate choice made in service of one vision. It is difficult to imagine that level of devotion to a single building. And then, just 10 years after his death, an even greater blow would strike the project. In July 1936, the Spanish Civil War erupted across the country. Just 2 days after the fighting began, young anarchists stormed Gaudi's workshop. They smashed his plaster models, burned his original drawings, and set fire to the crypt. Decades of planning, destroyed in a single night. All of it gone in one night. Most of the blueprints and scale models that Gaudi had spent his life creating were lost forever. Consider what that truly means for a building this complex. The architect was already dead, and now even his instructions for finishing the building were gone. The vision had been erased from the physical world almost entirely. Only a handful of fragments and partial photographs survived the destruction. The work of 4 decades had been reduced to broken plaster and ashes. And yet, even in that darkness, the building itself was still standing. 12 people connected to the construction and daily operation of the Sagrada Familia were killed. The violence was not random. The attackers targeted the building as a symbol of the old order. Gaudi's successor, an architect named Domingo Sugrañes, survived the initial attack. But he died just 2 years later, in 1938, at the age of 59. Many people who knew him believed that despair over the building's future had broken him. At that point in history, nobody believed the Sagrada Familia would ever be completed. The original architect had quit after 1 year. His visionary replacement had died unrecognized on the street. The plans and models had burned in the war. And the man who tried to carry on had died from the weight of it all. Every possible thread of continuity had been severed. So how did this building possibly survive all of that? The answer lies in one determined architect and a pile of broken plaster fragments. After the war ended, an architect named Francisco de Paula Quintana took charge of the site. He gathered every single fragment of the destroyed models that he could find in the rubble. Imagine trying to assemble a puzzle where most of the pieces are missing, and there is no picture on the box to guide you. That is essentially what Quintana spent years doing. He cross-referenced the broken plaster fragments with published photographs and surviving sketches. Piece by piece, he painstakingly reconstructed Gaudi's vision from memory and rubble. Generations of architects then carried the work forward after him. Puig I Boda, Bonet I Gari, Bonet I Armengol, and today the current lead, Jordi Fowley I Oyer. Each one inherited a project that nobody expected to finish in their own lifetime. That pattern itself became part of the Sagrada Familia tradition, building for the next generation. Modern technology eventually transformed the pace of construction entirely. 3D printing, computer modeling, and precision stone cutting accomplished in years what once took decades. Stones that would have taken craftsmen months to carve by hand could now be cut in hours. But throughout all of this progress, one surreal fact persisted in the background. The building had no official construction permit from the city of Barcelona. Gaudi had applied for a building permit back in 1885. But when the surrounding town was absorbed into Barcelona in 1897, the paperwork simply vanished. For 136 years, the most famous building in all of Spain was technically illegal. 136 years without a valid permit. In 2018, the foundation finally reached a settlement with the city of Barcelona. The agreement required payments of €36 million spread over 10 years. That money goes toward managing the impact that millions of visitors have on the surrounding streets. The project survived wartime rubble, decades of reconstruction, and 136 years of being technically illegal. The Sagrada Familia kept being built against every possible obstacle. And as the building slowly rose again, a new controversy erupted over its western wall. The Passion facade faces west and tells the story of suffering and death. Gaudi himself described what this facade should look like. He said it should appear as if made of bones, hard, bare, and stripped of all softness. A striking final instruction. In the 1980s, sculptor Josep Maria Suberchez took on the enormous task. His angular, expressionistic figures clashed sharply with Gaudi's organic curves. The public reaction in Barcelona was immediate and fierce. In 1990, 200 Barcelona artists and intellectuals signed a public statement condemning the work. They called the sculptures boorish and kitsch, a betrayal of Gaudi's vision. 200 signatures against one. The scenes on the facade read in a reverse S pattern, from lower left to upper right. The narrative begins with the Last Supper, and ends with the burial and ascension. But hidden within all this controversy, there is something quietly brilliant. On the facade, Suberchez placed a 4x4 grid of numbers. Every row, every column, and every diagonal in that grid adds up to 33. 33, the age at which Jesus was crucified. A standard 4x4 magic square normally adds up to 34. Suberchez deliberately altered the grid by repeating two numbers to reach exactly 33. Mathematics, theology, and art, all encoded in a single grid carved into stone. There is another detail that most visitors miss completely. Gaudi's own face has been sculpted into both of the completed facades. On the Nativity side, his features appear on the figure of Saint Joseph. On the Passion side, his face is given to the figure of the Apostle John. The architect is literally built into the walls of his own creation. And above all of these facades and their stories, the towers continued rising skyward. Gaudi designed 18 towers for the Sagrada Familia, and every single one carries a meaning. 12 of those towers represent the 12 apostles. 4 represent the evangelists, 1 honors the Virgin Mary, and 1 is dedicated to Jesus Christ. Why exactly 18 and not some round number? Because every number in this building carries a precise, theological meaning. 3 facades each with 4 towers, 3 times 4 makes 12 apostles. Add the 4 evangelists, the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ, and you reach exactly 18. The numbers 3 for the Holy Trinity, and 5 for the human senses repeat throughout the structure. Nothing in this entire building is accidental or decorative, without purpose. Each of the 4 evangelist towers stands about 135 meters tall. They are topped with biblical symbols, a winged angel, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. The Virgin Mary Tower reaches 138 meters, crowned with a glowing star 7.5 meters across. And then, the tallest of all. The Jesus Christ Tower reached its final height of 172.5 meters on February 20, 2026. That moment made the Sagrada Familia the tallest church on earth. It surpassed Ulm Minster in Germany, which had held the record at 161.5 meters. But Gaudi deliberately set this height with a philosophical limit in mind. He stated that human creation must not surpass the creation of God. The tower is intentionally shorter than Montjuic, the natural hill overlooking Barcelona. At the summit of the tower sits a cross, 17 meters tall and 13.5 meters wide. Each arm of that cross weighs about 12.8 tons. And the inside of the cross is completely hollow. That is not an engineering shortcut, it is part of Gaudi's original design. He intended for people to climb inside the cross and see Barcelona spread out in every direction. The colorful shapes crowning each tower are often mistaken for simple decorations. They are not decorations at all. They represent the fruits of the Holy Spirit, grapes, wheat, and olives. Every visible element on this building carries a meaning that Gaudi assigned over a century ago. And now his legacy has grown far beyond architecture entirely. In 1992, a group of citizens in Barcelona launched a campaign to make Gaudi a saint. Sainthood for an architect. But the Vatican took the proposal seriously from the beginning. In 2003, the Catholic Church formally opened his cause for beatification. And on April 14, 2025, Pope Francis declared Gaudi venerable. That is the first official step on the long path to being recognized as a saint. Most people picture Gaudi as a lifelong man of deep and unwavering faith. But the reality of his spiritual journey is more complicated than that. In his youth, Gaudi was not particularly devout or religious. His deep religious conviction came only after he began working on the Sagrada Familia. The building did not simply come from his faith. In many ways, the process of building this church actually created his faith. That reversal of cause and effect is worth pausing on for a moment. The Sagrada Familia was not just his greatest work of architecture. It was his spiritual autobiography, written in stone over the course of 43 years. By the end of his life, he described the building as a prayer that would outlast him. On June 10, 2026, exactly 100 years after Gaudi's death, something extraordinary is planned. Pope Leo XIV will preside over a consecration mass at the Sagrada Familia. The ceremony will also bless and inaugurate the completed Jesus Christ Tower. About 8,000 people are expected to gather inside and outside the basilica for the event. A centenary, a consecration, and a step toward sainthood, all converging on a single day. The glory facade, the last major unfinished piece of the building, still remains. It will represent resurrection, eternal glory, and the final chapter of the biblical story. When completed, it will be the largest and most elaborate of all three facades. The builders expect to complete that final facade between 2033 and 2035. After 144 years, the end is in sight. But perhaps the ending was never the point. Stand inside the Sagrada Familia one more time. Look up through the stone branches at the light shifting slowly across the ceiling. Gaudi gave 43 years to a building he knew would outlive him by generations. The workers who carved the first stones never saw the towers rise above the skyline. The donors who paid for each column never sat beneath the completed ceiling. Boccabella, the bookseller who started it all, never even saw the walls reach his own height. And yet, generation after generation, people kept building. Through war, through fire, through controversy, and through a full century of doubt. So what drives people to build something they know they will never see completed? And what does it say about all of us that 144 years later, we are still building it? The Sagrada Familia in Barcelona is not just a church. It is the longest act of faith in the history of modern architecture. And it is still not finished.